The cabin fell silent a split second before it happened, like the air itself braced for impact. "Get out of here." The words tore through first class like a blade, sharp enough to make every passenger lift their head at once. Then came the slap. The flight attendant's hand cracked across the black woman's face, clean, loud, stunning in its disrespect. Her blazer was cream immaculate, her posture pristine. Yet she didn't rise, didn't recoil, didn't shout. She simply absorbed the blow with the stillness of someone who had seen storms far worse than this. The passengers froze, eyes wide above half-eaten plates and untouched glasses of champagne. The man in seat 4B lifted his phone recording before his mind even caught up with what his hands were doing. A red arrow might as well have been pointing at him, his lens already locked on the unfolding injustice. A security officer rushed in from the galley boots, heavy against the carpeted floor. He stopped beside the furious flight attendant, jaw tight, hand hovering near the restraint straps on his belt. "Ma'am," he warned, voice clipped with manufactured authority, "if you don't comply, I'll have to escort you off this aircraft." The flight attendant leaned closer, her breath hot with contempt. "You heard him. You don't belong up here." But the woman in the cream blazer didn't flinch. She simply lifted her chin, eyes steady, as if she were appraising a child throwing a tantrum rather than an employee assaulting her in front of a dozen witnesses. Around them, the cabin shifted, micro-expressions flickering across faces. Shock, guilt, curiosity, fear, a silent simmering question. What gives them the right to treat her like this? The flight attendant jabbed a finger toward her again. "I said move. Last warning." Passengers inhaled sharply. The woman only crossed her legs, adjusting the strap of her black designer bag with slow, deliberate calm. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke, but it carried through the cabin like thunder rolling beneath the floor. "I own this jet." The security officer blinked. The attendant froze mid-breath. The man recording almost dropped his phone, and for the first time since the slap, a new tension filled the room, one that didn't belong to chaos but to truth finally beginning to stir. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to her. For a moment, no one moved. The slap still hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. The security officer's hand hovered awkwardly above his belt, torn between authority and uncertainty. The flight attendant, still breathing hard, looked stunned, almost as if the force of her own outburst finally hit her instead of the woman she struck. Around them, first class shifted. A glass clinked somewhere, a fork dropped. People whispered names they couldn't quite hear, trying to place the face of the woman who sat so impossibly calm in seat 2A. But she didn't give them time. Her fingers rose slowly to her cheek, touching the spot where the slap landed, not with pain, but with a kind of quiet disbelief. A disbelief that had nothing to do with the strike, and everything to do with how familiar this moment felt. Too familiar. The flight attendant straightened, trying to reclaim control. "Ownership doesn't mean you can sit wherever you want," she snapped. "On this aircraft, you follow my rules." The woman looked up, at her eyes steady. "You assaulted a paying passenger," she said softly, so softly that the softness became its own threat. "And now you're doubling down." A ripple spread through the cabin, small, sharp, electric. The man recording lowered his phone just enough to whisper, "She did board early. I remember seeing her." Another passenger, a middle-aged woman with a silver scarf, leaned closer. "She's not acting like someone who snuck in. She's acting like someone who's used to being here." The security officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I need to verify your boarding status. If you don't—" She didn't let him finish. Her voice slipped into the space between his words, calm as a closing door. "Check the manifest." He blinked. The attendant blinked. Someone gasped, because no one ever tells security to check the manifest. No one except people who know exactly what's on it. The tension shifted just a degree, but enough to tilt the whole cabin. The woman reached for her phone again, but not in panic. She tapped once lightly, as if confirming a meeting she set days ago. "Rachel," she said quietly, "they've escalated it. Begin the audit." On the other end, her assistant's voice, cool, efficient, unmistakably professional, came through just loud enough for the two employees to hear. "Already in motion." The flight attendant's jaw dropped. The security officer took half a step back. And the passengers, every last one of them, leaned forward in their seats, because suddenly this wasn't a confrontation anymore. It was a countdown. The cabin didn't breathe. The flight attendant's smile, if it could even be called that, twitched at the edges, brittle as glass, under too much pressure. She tried to stand taller, tried to reclaim the authority, slipping from her fingers like sand. "An audit," she scoffed. "You think saying big words is going to fix the mess you caused?" But her voice betrayed her, a tremor, barely there but unmistakable. The security officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, suddenly less sure of his stance. The passengers sensed it, the wobble in the narrative they'd been fed. Something in the room had tilted small but seismic. And then from row 4, a young man cleared his throat. He hadn't spoken yet, had barely moved. He wore simple clothes, a navy hoodie, earbuds dangling around his neck. But he'd been watching closely, intently, the kind of watching done by people who recognize injustice because they've lived close to it. Too close. I saw her name, he said, voice, unsure at first, on the boarding screen, before anyone else got on. The flight attendant snapped toward him. You must be mistaken. He swallowed, then straightened. No, he repeated stronger this time. I'm not. A pulse went through the cabin like the sound of a gavel striking wood. The woman in the cream blazer didn't turn to look at him. She didn't need to. Instead, she rested her hands on her lap posture, still unshakably calm, a calmness that now felt dangerous. The attendant stepped forward, eyes sharp with panic. You don't get to undermine crew authority. Sit down. But the young man didn't sit. Another passenger, an older woman with a travel pillow still around her neck, spoke up. He's not undermining anything, she said. He's telling the truth. 2 witnesses, 2 cracks. The room was changing faster than the crew could patch it together. The security officer glanced toward the cockpit as if hoping for instructions that weren't coming. The captain hadn't intervened. He didn't want to be part of this. The woman in the cream blazer finally lifted her eyes to the officer, calm, precise, surgical. You called me non-compliant, she said. Yet I'm the only one following protocol. He opened his mouth, but she held up a hand just slightly barely above her lap, and somehow that small gesture carried more authority than any badge in the room. Run the manifest, she said softly. Run it. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. The flight attendant's confidence began to crack, the panic beneath it rising fast, messy, impossible to hide. Because this was the moment everyone realized if she wasn't lying, if her name was on that manifest, then everything that came next would belong to her. Every consequence, every fallout, every ounce of power, and the countdown that began in part 2, it had just hit 0. The security officer finally reached for his tablet. Not confidently, not with authority, but the way someone reaches for a light switch in a dark basement hoping it works. And terrified it might. A hush spread as he tapped the screen. The passengers leaned in. Even the engines outside felt quieter, like the entire jet was waiting for what came next. The flight attendant lunged closer. Don't check anything, she snapped, voice breaking. She isn't registered. I already looked. But her eyes, those frantic darting eyes, told a different story. The beginning of fear, the kind born not from guilt alone, but from knowing the truth was no longer in her hands. The woman in the cream blazer watched her with calm precision, head slightly tilted. Funny, she murmured. I haven't seen you look at a single screen since you boarded. A wave of murmurs rippled through first class. She was right. The attendant hadn't verified anything. Not a name, not a seat. Not even the ticket she tore. The young man in the navy hoodie crossed his arms. Just let him check. If she's lying, you win, right? The attendant whipped toward him. Stay out of this. But now, 2 more passengers, middle-aged businessmen from row 3, shifted uncomfortably. Why not check? One asked. What are you afraid of? Said the other. Pressure mounted like heat in a sealed cabin. The officer's thumb hovered above the manifest icon. Then, the attendant grabbed his wrist. Gasps shot through the cabin like sparks. She didn't yank hard, but the intent was unmistakable. Control, desperation, panic dressed as authority. Don't, she hissed. She forged it. I know her type. That sentence, I know her type, struck the room harder than the slap in part 1. One of the older women in first class recoiled. Oh no. No. We're not doing the type thing today. The attendant froze, realizing too late she'd said the quiet part out loud. The woman in the cream blazer finally rose from her seat. Slowly, elegantly, the way a storm stands up before it hits. She didn't raise her voice, didn't step closer, didn't posture. She simply said, run the manifest, or I will. The security officer swallowed hard, tore his arm free, and tapped the icon. A loading wheel spun. A beat. Another. The cabin leaned forward. Then a soft chime. The officer's face drained of color, because there it was, in clean white text against a navy background. Passenger name, Dr. Alana Rivers, owner, Horizon Private Aviation. The room didn't breathe. The countdown that began in part 2 had ended. The explosion was coming. For a full second, no one spoke. The security officer stared at the screen as if willing the letters to rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. Dr. Alana Rivers. Not passenger, not VIP. Owner. The words sat there like a detonator. The young man in the navy hoodie let out a low whistle. Oh. Y'all messed up. A few passengers laughed, not because any of this was funny, but because tension had finally snapped into disbelief. The flight attendant took a step back, shaking her head. No, no, this can't be real. I checked the list. I checked it, but her voice had lost all bite. Panic frayed every syllable. The woman with the silver scarf leaned forward, her tone sharper now. You didn't check anything. You judged her. The attendant's face flushed deep red. I was following protocol. No, Alana said quietly. You were following prejudice. Her voice wasn't angry, and somehow that made it cut deeper. The attendant's breath hitched, but before she could spit another excuse, Alana's expression shifted subtle distant. A flicker of memory crossed her face. The kind that doesn't ask permission to surface. At 24, she'd boarded her first business class flight wearing a suit she saved 6 months to afford. The gate agent never scanned her ticket, just told her with a smile that wasn't a smile. Sweetheart. This line is for premium customers. She'd walked back to economy cheeks, burning the ticket, shaking in her hand. Now, decades later on the plane, she owned the same tone echoed back at her. The slap in part one hadn't hurt nearly as much as the recognition. The cabin watched her eyes, softening, posture shifting as if they could feel that flash of history pulsing beneath her calm. The security officer took a tentative step forward. Dr. Rivers. I didn't know. That's the problem, she replied. None of you cared to. The attendant snapped, grasping for any shred of control. Look, even if your name is there, you still caused a disruption, ma'am. The officer cut in quietly. She didn't cause anything. The passengers murmured in agreement. You slapped her. You tore her ticket. You tried to stop the manifest check. This is on you. One by one, voices rose, not yelling, just stating facts with the steady weight of witnesses who'd seen enough. The attendant backed toward the galley like an animal cornered by truth. This isn't fair, she whispered. Alana's gaze held steady, unflinching. Fairness, she said softly. It's like humming. And somewhere at the back of the cabin, someone whispered, she hasn't even started yet. The pressure in the room shifted again, this time toward inevitability. The reckoning was coming next. The cabin didn't cool down. It tightened. Like the air itself knew something irreversible was about to happen. The flight attendant pressed her back against the galley wall, fingers trembling, eyes darting between passengers who no longer feared her authority. The security officer stood frozen, manifest still glowing in his hand like a confession he wished he hadn't read. Dr. Alana Rivers inhaled slowly, not dramatically, not victoriously, just with intention, as if reclaiming the oxygen that had been taken from her. Then she lifted her phone again. Rachel, she said, voice, a measured calm that made every crew member flinch, begin Protocol 7. A beat of silence. Then her assistant's voice, crisp, unwavering, filled the space between rows. Protocol 7 confirmed. Flight crew audit initiating. Command channel open. The attendant's knees buckled. No, 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 no. She can't do that. But even she didn't believe her own words. The passengers did, though. Everyone did. The young man in the hoodie looked around, eyebrows raised. Protocol 7. That doesn't sound like a customer complaint. The silver scarf woman nodded, whispering, that sounds like something only someone in charge would know. The security officer swallowed hard. Dr. Rivers, what does that protocol do? Alana didn't turn toward him. Her gaze stayed locked on the flight attendant who had slapped her, ripped her ticket, and tried desperately to bury the truth. It records, she said quietly. Everything. The officer's eyes widened. Rachel's voice returned louder this time, as if coming from the walls themselves. All crew actions for Flight 781 have been logged. All verbal interactions archived. Compliance board notified. Stand by for status review. The attendant's face collapsed. No, you don't understand, please. This will ruin me. Alana lifted a hand gently, stopping her words the way a door stops a draft. What ruined you, she said softly, was the moment you chose to hit someone you thought had no power. The murmurs swelled. Not angry, not cheering, just truth acknowledging itself. The security officer stepped closer, voice unsteady. Ma'am, is there anything you'd like me to do? Yes, Alana replied without hesitation. Stand back and wait. He obeyed instantly, and the passengers understood this wasn't a confrontation anymore. This was a transition. Alana Rivers had stopped defending herself. She was now in control. And the cabin, once divided, now leaned entirely in her direction, as if every person on that aircraft had realized the slap was the beginning, the reckoning was next. The aircraft felt too still, not peaceful but charged like the pause before a verdict. The flight attendant clung to the edge of the galley counter, Knuckles' white breath shaking as she watched the passengers shift entirely out of her control. She had lost the room, lost authority, lost the narrative she'd built on quick judgments and quicker cruelty. And then she made her final mistake. "You think you can ruin our careers?" She snapped, her voice frayed and desperate, "just because you claim to be somebody?" Every head turned, slowly, precisely, dangerously, because that word claim was gasoline. Dr. Alana Rivers stepped forward just enough for the soft cabin light to land across her face. No theatrics, no anger, only a calm so sharp it felt like the room might cut itself on it. "You want to know who I am?" she asked quietly. The attendant opened her mouth, but nothing came out. No one else dared breathe. Alana held the silence the way a conductor holds a note, steady, deliberate, until the whole cabin leaned toward her. Then she spoke. Not loud, not rushed, just true. "I don't claim to be somebody. I am the one who signs your paychecks." The cabin broke. A collective gasp rolled through the rows. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." A man in business class stood halfway up, one hand over his mouth. The young man in the navy hoodie whispered a stunned, reverent, "Bro, she owns the airline." The attendant staggered back as though the words themselves hit harder than any slap she had delivered. You're the Alana," didn't give her the mercy of finishing the sentence. "Owner, chairwoman, majority shareholder," she said, each title dropped like a weight on the table. "This aircraft, this crew, this route, this entire fleet." Her gaze locked onto the attendant. "All of it runs because I allow it to." The security officer lowered his head. Passengers murmured soft curses, disbelief, apologies that weren't theirs to give. The attendant's voice cracked. "No, please, I didn't know," that Alana replied, "is the problem. You never asked, you only assumed." Silence swallowed the cabin, and in that silence, every passenger understood. This wasn't just a reveal, it was a reckoning, a shift in gravity, a moment where power corrected itself quietly but irrevocably. And the consequences, they were already on the way. The moment the final syllable left Alana's lips, the aircraft seemed to exhale not relief, but recognition, like the jet itself finally remembered who owned its wings. The flight attendant's back slid against the galley wall until she half sat, half collapsed on the metal ledge. Her eyes darted wildly from Alana to the passengers to the security officer searching for someone. Anyone who might still believe she was right. No one did. The officer cleared his throat, voice barely a whisper. "Dr. Rivers, awaiting instruction." That was it. One sentence, and every fragile illusion of authority the crew clung to disintegrated. Alana didn't raise her voice, didn't step forward. She simply lifted her phone and said, "Rachel, initiate compliance strike." A heartbeat. Then the cabin speaker, normally used for mundane announcements about turbulence or arrival times, came alive with a tone none of them had ever heard. A sharp, sterile chime, followed by Rachel's voice, clear and merciless. "Compliance strike engaged. Crew audit completed. 3 violations identified. Credentials revoked. Access terminated." The flight attendant's badge blinked once, twice, then glowed solid red. Her breath hitched. No, this can't be happening. Please listen, just let me explain." But Rachel's voice continued impenetrable. "Flight attendant. 2146. Immediate removal from active roster. Security officer 09, suspended pending investigation." The officer's eyes widened as his own badge flickered red. A low, stunned murmur rippled through first class. "Holy, she just fired them from the plane. This is unreal." But it wasn't unreal. It was precise, calculated, corporate justice executed with the calm of someone who'd been forced to swallow indignity far too many times. The attendant scrambled forward on her knees, reaching out not to Alana, but toward the passengers as though they might save her. "Please, someone, tell her she misunderstood. I was just doing my job." Alana's gaze was steady, almost gentle. "You weren't doing your job," she said. "You were abusing your position. And now you're facing the consequences of it." The silver scarf woman shook her head. "She gave you so many chances to back down." The young man in the hoodie added, "You picked the wrong person to try and bully." The attendant's shoulders collapsed inward. Her voice shrank into something small. I didn't know who she was." Alana stepped closer, not threatening, not triumphant, just resolute. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said. "You only needed to know who you were supposed to be." The final blow landed quietly, and the cabin knew this wasn't the end of the collapse. It was only the beginning. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It happened in layers, slow, humiliating, impossible to stop. The flight attendant stayed frozen on the galley floor, badge still pulsing red like a warning light on a failing engine. The security officer stood upright, but the color had drained from his face. His eyes flicked anywhere except toward Alana. He knew better than to challenge the gravity of what just happened. And then the passengers began to rise. Not physically, but morally. One by one, voices that had been quiet now stepped into the open. The silver scarf woman was the first. "You didn't just disrespect her," she said, turning toward the flight attendant. "You disrespected all of us by assuming we wouldn't notice." The young man in the hoodie lifted his phone again, but this time not to film, to hold the truth in the air. "I got the whole thing," he said, "not to shame you, but because this is how people like us protect ourselves when staff like you try to erase us." The attendant's lips trembled. I told you I didn't know, and she didn't need you to know," he shot back. "She needed you to treat her like a human being." A man in business attire from row 3 stepped forward, adjusting the sleeves of his blazer as he spoke. "I've flown this airline for 20 years. I've seen rude staff, lazy staff, power-tripping staff, but never something like this. You didn't fail protocol, you failed character." A murmur of agreement swept through the cabin, rich and unanimous. Another voice rose, this one from a younger woman in row 2. "You treated her like she didn't belong because of how she looked. But the truth is," she nodded toward Alana, "everyone in this cabin belongs here because she allowed it." The words hit the flight attendant harder than any corporate ruling. Her eyes filled. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice brittle. I genuinely am. But apologies spoken only after consequences don't soften the damage. They just add weight to the realization. Alana didn't mock her, didn't smirk, didn't savor the fall. She simply regarded her with that same steady calm that had carried her through the slap, the accusations, the humiliation. "You're apologizing to save yourself," she said quietly. "Not because you understand." The attendant looked down, silenced. The cabin held its breath, waiting to see what Alana would do next. But she didn't lash out, didn't raise her voice, didn't demand anything. Instead, she turned toward the passengers, the very people who had witnessed everything. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not for defending me, but for refusing to stay silent." The young man nodded. "We weren't protecting you," he said. "We were protecting what's right." And for the first time since the slap, something shifted. Not tension, not fear, but respect. Alana Rivers wasn't just the owner. She was the standard. The cabin had already shifted. Moral authority belonged entirely to Alana. But now the atmosphere changed again, deeper, heavier. This time it wasn't personal, it was legal. Alana lifted her phone once more, her posture straight as a verdict. "Rachel," she said, "move to legal dispatch. I want full documentation prepared." Every crew member stiffened at those words. Legal dispatch wasn't customer service. It wasn't complaint resolution. It was the department that handled lawsuits, terminations, and regulatory violations. A beat later, Rachel's voice filled the cabin like a courtroom speaker. "Copy. Legal protocol engaged. FAA compliance forms drafted. Crew misconduct file prepared. All evidence archived and encrypted." Several passengers gasped. They knew what that meant. The security officer did too. His voice cracked as he stepped forward. "Dr. Rivers, please, if there's anything I can do, there is," she replied evenly. "You can stop speaking." His mouth snapped shut. The flight attendant pressed her palms to the floor, breath-shallow tears threatening but not falling. She was caught in the realization that this was no longer a job issue. This was a career-ending crisis. "I'm begging you," she whispered. "Please, don't file anything with the FAA. They'll blacklist me. I'll never work again." Alana met her eyes. "Then you should have thought about that before putting your hands on a passenger, before tearing a valid ticket, before lying, before escalating." Each phrase landed with surgical precision. The attendant broke, not dramatically, quietly. The worst kind of collapse. "I'm sorry," she choked out. I really am." Alana didn't look away. "Your apology doesn't erase your actions. It only acknowledges them." She turned toward the security officer next. "You detained a passenger without verification. You ignored procedure. You acted on assumption, not evidence." He swallowed hard. I never meant—" "You meant enough to act," she said. "That's all the FAA needs." Passengers murmured a chorus of agreement, disappointment, inevitability. Rachel's voice returned, slicing through the tension. "Dr. Rivers' legal packet is ready for review. Time-stamped, verified. Shall I transmit to aviation compliance authorities?" The entire cabin froze. This was the moment. The final warning, not for her, but for them. Alana exhaled once slowly. "Not yet," she said. "First, I want them to understand exactly what they've done. The flight attendant looked up trembling. What do you mean, Alana? Stepped forward, eyes steady, voice quieter than ever, but carrying the weight of the entire aircraft. You didn't just insult a passenger. A beat. You endangered a black woman on her own jet because you assumed she didn't belong. Silence fell pure, absolute. And that, Alana finished, is something the law will always remember. The collapse was no longer happening. It was complete. The cabin felt suspended, as if the jet itself refused to move until Alana spoke again. The flight attendant knelt on the galley floor, breaths thin and uneven. The security officer stood stiff, his badge still blinking red with every panicked heartbeat. Passengers watched in a silence so focused, it felt like the room had become a courtroom, and Alana Rivers was presiding judge. Rachel's last words still echoed from the speaker. Shall I transmit to aviation compliance authorities? Transmit. One tap. Careers over, lives reshaped. A permanent mark on their aviation records. The attendant clasped her hands together. Dr. Rivers, please, please. I know I was wrong, I know it now, but if you send that file, they'll never hire me again. I'll lose everything. Her voice cracked on the word everything, and the room felt the weight of it. For the first time, Alana's expression softened. Barely, but enough for the cabin to sense it. Because this wasn't a woman who lived for revenge. This was a woman who understood consequence because she had lived through it herself. Her gaze drifted for a moment, not to anyone in the cabin, but inward into a memory that still pulsed like a bruise. 20 years ago, she had been escorted out of a hotel lobby she owned shares and no explanation, no apology. The manager wasn't fired. He wasn't even reprimanded. He simply moved on while she carried the sting for years. Power doesn't erase pain, but it can prevent its repetition. Alana looked back at the attendant, her voice quiet but steady. You didn't lose everything today because of me, she said. You lost it because you believed you had the right to decide who belongs. The attendant swallowed. Tears finally fell. I understand, she whispered. I do. No, Alana said gently. You're beginning to understand. That's different. The security officer stepped forward, shoulders sagging with remorse. Dr. Rivers, if there's any way I can make this right. You can, she answered, by learning from it and making sure you never repeat it with another passenger who doesn't fit your expectations. The passengers nodded, every one of them like a jury affirming the verdict. Rachel's voice chimed again. Awaiting final instruction, Alana exhaled. Then she made the decision only someone with real power and real dignity could make. Rachel, she said, hold the transmission. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The attendant looked up stunned. You're not sending it? Not unless I have to, Alana replied. Accountability isn't about destroying people. It's about transforming them. Her voice deepened, soft but absolute. This is your chance. Your only chance. Don't waste it. The attendant bowed her head. I won't, she whispered. And in the heavy, breathless silence that followed, the cabin realized Alana Rivers wasn't just powerful. She was principled, and that made her unstoppable. The jet was quiet now, not the fearful kind of quiet that had filled the cabin earlier, but a deliberate, reverent silence. The kind that follows truth when it finally settles into a room and claims its place. The flight attendant wiped her face, still kneeling, not out of humiliation anymore, but out of reckoning. The security officer stood beside her, head bowed just slightly, not in defeat but in understanding. Passengers watched them both, then watched Alana, the axis on which this entire moment had turned. She didn't gloat, she didn't smirk, she didn't even sit back down right away. Instead, she walked slowly to the center of the aisle, not to address the crew, but to address the cabin. You all witnessed what happened today, she said, voice steady, warm, controlled. You saw how quickly assumptions can turn a safe space into a dangerous one. Not a single eye looked away. Some of you stepped forward, some of you spoke up, and some of you realized, maybe for the first time, that silence can be its own kind of harm. The young man in the hoodie lowered his gaze. The silver scarf woman nodded, tears in her eyes. Alana continued, I didn't respond with anger because anger isn't what changes systems. Accountability does, dignity does, truth does. She turned toward the flight attendant who couldn't bring herself to stand. You made serious mistakes, Alana said gently, and there are consequences for that. But consequence is not the same as destruction. Learn from this, rise from this, and never treat anyone as less again. The attendant nodded, shaking. I won't, she whispered. Alana finally returned to her seat, smoothing her blazer as she sat. She exhaled slowly, grounding herself in the leather cushions she legally and symbolically owned. Rachel's voice returned over the intercom, calm and businesslike. Compliance strike on hold. Crew placed under provisional suspension. Awaiting your command for final clearance, Dr. Rivers. Alana tapped her phone once. Rachel, finalize the temporary suspension and schedule retraining. They'll answer for what they did, but they'll also get the chance to be better. Understood, Rachel replied. A soft wave of relief moved through the cabin, not for the crew, but for the world Alana was modeling. The silver scarf woman breathed out. That, she whispered, is leadership. The young man murmured, that's what power looks like when it's used right. Alana folded her hands in her lap, gazed steady out the cabin window where sunlight bled across the clouds like a quiet blessing. I didn't raise my voice today, she said softly to no one in particular, but I raised the standard, and the entire cabin knew they had just witnessed the kind of justice that doesn't shout. It stands, it transforms, it changes the air itself. Fade out.